We will go ahead and get things kicked off here. Appreciate everybody being here for our 10 and 20 event. My name is Dalton Miller. I am the Government Affairs Manager here at the State Chamber. Appreciate everyone joining us for this virtual event about our nation's supply chain. Want to say a special thanks to DeLisi. I believe we have Kermit Frank on the call with us today. Big thanks to Kermit and everyone over there at DeLisi for sponsoring us today and allowing us to host this virtual event for you all. The State Chamber's 10 and 20 events are designed to give you all, the membership, just a little taste and specifically 10 things that you need to know in 20 minutes on a hot button issue that's happening right now. And today's issue about the supply chain could not be any more relevant. We are fortunate and lucky enough to have an expert in the supply chain with us today, John Drake, who is with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's Vice President of Supply Chain Policy there at the U.S. Chamber. He oversees the development and implementation of the Chamber's supply chain policy priorities and represents the Chamber before Congress, the administration, the business community, and other stakeholders. John collaborates with the Chamber member companies and business community to educate policymakers in Congress, in the federal government, in the international community about the challenges and opportunities facing businesses at ports of entry and along the global supply chain. In addition, he manages the efforts of the supply chains of the Chamber's Supply Chain Leadership Council, which governs the supply chain advocacy activities of the Chamber and the Supply Chain Working Group, a large group of companies and associations promoting the modernization of global supply chains and cross-border trade. So with that introduction, we will go ahead and kick it off, and I'll pass it over to you, John. Welcome. Thank you for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I think I've got a presentation. I think if you could pull that up. So again, thank you for having me. I think top of the call, the supply chain crisis is something that I think everyone is feeling in some form or manner. I think we're all hearing that, we should be doing our Christmas shopping early if we haven't already started. And this crisis that we're facing right now at our ports with our trucks and so on is an unprecedented crisis that is a long time coming, and it's going to be some time, I think, before we work our way out of. So I'm going to work through this presentation here. I will tell you at the top that it's designed for kind of a longer discussion, but I think the State Chamber can provide the presentation to all of you if you'd like it, but I'll sort of focus on a few of the slides here and then maybe skip over some of the other ones. So top line, how did we get here? COVID. A lot of Americans' buying habits shifted during COVID. There was also shutdowns in factories and production around the same time that COVID was at its worst. We had a lot of businesses that were in the logistics and transport sector that went under at the peak of COVID in March, April of last year. That added a lot of disruption to the ability for businesses to get goods to where they need to go. And then, frankly, just some underlying long-term issues that really began to kind of spout their head, right? Tariffs being one, lack of investment in our transportation infrastructure, and labor shortages. So moving to the next slide, please. So I think this, this chart, if you look on the right, shows that there was a huge drop in consumer spending right around the time of March, April, when a lot of the shutdown orders went into effect. And with it was a huge drop in confidence by the US consumers, a drop in spending that quickly kind of came back, but at the time signaled a lot of businesses that US consumer spending was not going to be returning anytime soon. Next chart, please. But there was quickly, following that time, there was a huge injection of stimulus spending by Congress and President Trump to the tune of about $1.6 trillion that put a lot of money back into the system very quickly, so much so that you can actually see that the poverty rate actually went down around the time that this investment bill went into effect. Next slide, please. And some of these slides aren't coming through. I don't know if everyone can see them, but on my end, they may not be coming all the way through. But what's important with this slide here in terms of real retail sales is while there was a drop in retail sales around the time of March, April, you can see that very quickly, not only did retail sales return, but they went well above the historic norms and where a lot of retailers expected that retail sales were going to be over the next few months. And, and this was in large part because of a big change in how Americans were spending their dollars around this time. A lot of people were home, they were under quarantine, they were under shutdown orders. And so they weren't going out to restaurants, they weren't going out to shows, they weren't traveling. So for those Americans who did have money that they could spend, they were shifting those investments away from the travel and so on, and instead going online, doing retail purchases, et cetera. And this led to a huge increase in demand for goods coming here to the US. Next slide, please. And you can see just how quickly this spending came back. So if the yellow line here in this slide shows the return to spending levels during the Great Recession from 2008 to 2012, but you see a very compressed timeline of a huge drop in consumption, but a huge return very, very quickly. Next slide, please. Let's keep going, please. Keep going. Keep going. So really kind of like what the trends were happening around this time is you had a drop in spending that quickly returned. A lot of businesses that were laying off workers around this time, thinking that U.S. demand was not going to be returning anytime soon, they now had to react to a huge increase in consumer spending, and in many cases simply did not have the capacity in terms of trucking, in terms of rail, et cetera, to meet that new demand. Around the time that Americans were buying a lot, there was a lot of factories overseas in China, in Southeast Asia, that were shut down because of COVID. And when those factories came back online, a lot of it resulted in a huge surge of products that were coming here to the United States very, very quickly and well above historic norms. So when you take into account that you had ships that were arriving here with much higher volumes than what would normally happen, and without the workforce at the dock, at the truck, at the warehouses, et cetera, to recover it all, it led to a huge sort of grind and a huge sort of bottleneck at our ports, specifically the LA and Long Beach. Next slide, please. And labor shortages, this is also, I think, really key. We've been hearing a lot about the Great Resignation. Over the last couple of years, U.S. workers have incredibly more market power than what they've had historically. But if you also take into account that on the transportation logistics side, these industries have been faced with some long-term challenges that were really only exacerbated by COVID. Take a look at the trucking side, for example. Prior to COVID, there was a shortage of approximately 40,000 truck drivers there to serve the levels of freight that we were seeing in 2019, 2020. A lot of truck drivers, were over the age of 45 on average, and so with COVID, when there was a number of trucking companies that went out, 3 times the usual number of trucking companies that went out of business in any given year went out of business last year, you had approximately 100,000 truck drivers who were also displaced. A good number of those drivers chose to take early retirement, or they just moved on to different fields. And it's been very difficult to return those levels of drivers back to where they were pre-COVID. So today we've got approximately 80,000, shortage of 80,000 drivers than what we need for the current freight levels, which is creating its own bottlenecks. And you're also seeing what have been some long-term challenges by the trucking industry really very much upfront, recruiting new and younger drivers, getting those skill sets in place, et cetera. And around and typically what would normally happen around these times is that U.S. employers would seek out immigrants to take on some of these jobs, and help kind of bolster the workforce. There hasn't been an increase in immigrants coming to the U.S. in the last couple of years, and so that has taken away what historically been a resource for many employers. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Why is everyone talking about these two ports? The reason for that is because 40% of all imports enter into the U.S. into these two ports. So they are, without a doubt, the two most important ports in the United States. And they're also the two largest ports in the United States. Next slide, please. And you can kind of see here this chart that shows the amount of traffic that is coming into these ports over and above, what they've historically seen. A huge surge in container traffic. Next slide, please. And you can see that and again, this is taking into account September to October numbers, but just the huge number of ships that are waiting to be offloaded. You can actually see pictures of this, pretty readily, where it almost looks like a parking lot off the coast of Southern California of all these container ships that are waiting to berth at the two ports. And in some cases, many, up until a few weeks ago, some of these ships had been sitting off for months at a time. Next slide. This just kind of shows these change in container volume so approximately a 20% increase in container traffic at these two ports. Next slide. Next slide, please. And I think while we're starting to see some relief, there has been a decrease in the rates that ocean carriers have been quoting to shippers. At one point we were hearing that a move that would cost approximately $3,000 to move a container here in the United States back in 2019. Some of our members were hearing a quote of anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 for that same move, which was obviously a huge impact. But thankfully, we're beginning to see some relief on that side. But it's still a significant increase in what has been historic rates for container shipments. Next slide. So while there's been some relief on the container side, and there's been a decrease in congestion at the two ports, overall, I think the private sector thinking continues to be pessimistic that we're going to see relief anytime soon. And there's good reasons for that. For example, next year, the ILWU is expected to renegotiate their labor contracts for the West Coast ports. If you remember 2002, or if you remember 2015, 2016, oftentimes these labor negotiations can be really intense. There can be slowdowns of work as the longshoremen are work to slow down the amount of containers as they're being offloaded. In 2002, the Hart-Taffley Act had to be imposed to bring the workers back to the table. But there still remains a huge backlog of containers that are still at our ports. And we expect that it's going to take some time to clean those containers off and get them where they need to go. Next slide, please. And I think, another big thing that we're bringing a lot of attention to, and I think this is really important, is the overall productivity of U.S. ports. Despite the fact that the ports of LA and Long Beach handle 40% of all U.S. imports, they're ranked 328th and 333rd out of 351 ports worldwide. Ports in Asia, the Middle East, and North America dominate the top 50 spots. And our best ranked port by this metric, by productivity, is Philadelphia at number 83 in the world. And if you look at this, it really shows that there's our ports are quickly becoming not just a bottleneck for moving goods both into the United States as well as out of the United States, but they're also becoming their own sort of economic impediments as well, because the longer it takes to move a port off of, the longer it takes to move a container off a ship and where it needs to go only adds the cost of moving that good, but it also creates additional uncertainty in the business community as well. So this is something that we feel really needs a lot of attention by both policymakers at the state level as well as the federal level, because it's it continues to only go on a downward trajectory, only getting worse and not better. Next slide, please. So what we've been calling for is that we need to continue pushing getting containers off port property. Specifically, we need to be taking a hard look at the rules that govern containers and chassis, the port schedules, moving toward a 24/7 schedule, locating additional space for containers that are being offloaded, and not just the ports of LA and Long Beach, but ports nationwide. There needs to be better communication for all parties, especially with ocean carriers and terminal operators. There also needs to be a doubling of the cap of employment-based visas, including H-1B temporary visa, worker visas, and H-2Bs. And there also needs to be tariff relief as well. And then long-term, next slide, please. There needs to be better data sharing among ocean carriers, terminals, and truckers. Good example of this is, ocean carriers oftentimes will not share the owner of a container to the terminal when it's being offloaded. So when you see these piles and piles of containers, when you're, look at the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, or if you're just looking at the live feed of the ports themselves, oftentimes these containers are not stacked based on who owns a container, right? So all the Walmart containers are in one pile of containers, all the Target containers, et cetera. They're all stacked randomly. The ocean carriers need to do a better job of sharing the owners, the container ownership with the terminals themselves, so that the terminals can do a better job of organizing these containers when they're being offloaded. There needs to be increased public investment in port infrastructure. The most recent infrastructure bill that was signed into law was a good first step, but quite frankly, Congress has been historically very stingy with our nation's infrastructure and investing in it. And while this infrastructure bill that provides $17 billion for our ports is a good first step, it doesn't counter the historic underinvestment that Congress and state governments, for that matter, have provided for our ports themselves. And it's going to take some time for us to work through that. We need to also be pushing labor to be embracing automation and other opportunities to improve the productivity at ports themselves. That 328 and 333 numbers for the ports of LA and Long Beach, they're not going to get better until the ports are willing to embrace automation, AI, other sorts of applications that will improve the flow through of containers moving through our ports. And then, I think last important thing that I want to highlight here is just policymakers need to recognize the importance of ports and supply chains in their planning and investment decisions. Oftentimes, it's a lot easier for policymakers to sell a new transit project or a bike path than it is to sell, the need for digging deeper waters to accommodate larger ships at our ports. And hopefully, this crisis that we're going through today will be a good opportunity to, impress upon policymakers the need to be continuing to invest in our ports and freight infrastructure. And with that, I know I've thrown a lot at you. Hopefully some of this was useful, but happy to answer any questions.
Right. Well, thank you, John. Obviously, it's a very complex issue, so we certainly appreciate you boiling it down for us like you have. So like John said, we'll take any questions. If you want to insert those in the chat, we can read them off here, or if you would like to unmute yourself and speak up, we just ask that you do that in an orderly fashion, and we'll carve out the next about 10 minutes for questions.
This is James Ashford. I got a quick question.
Yeah.
Do the ports prioritize raw materials over finished goods so that manufacturers in the U.S. that are needing to produce stuff on our soil can get those raw materials faster?
Not necessarily. The ports themselves were so the terminal operators have agreements with shippers and with the ocean carriers to determine, how quickly stuff gets offloaded, where it gets offloaded, how stuff is prioritized. So it's largely sort of a contract by contract sort of negotiation. There's no necessarily, overall policy that governs what type of good is going to be offloaded first. And oftentimes it just comes down to what ship is at terminal, and trying to get that ship offloaded as quickly as possible so it can move on to its next location.
Other questions?
We have a couple in the chat.
Okay, let's see. We've got a couple here in the chat. Mark Funky, is there a different fee structure for trucks entering the LA port depending on if they are union or non-union haulers?
Not necessarily, no. So there are approximately 15 terminal operators at the ports of LA and Long Beach. Each one of these terminal operators is privately owned. In many cases, they're owned by the ocean carrier, so like the Maersk or the Mediterranean Shipping Company, or some other ocean carrier. In some cases, they're independent of the ocean carriers, but they will oftentimes set their own fees for access to the terminal. And in some cases, larger shippers may get a reduction in that fee based on the amount of volume that they're moving through those terminals. But oftentimes it's purely based on, it can be based on the time of day that you're looking to access support. So for example, nighttime hours are typically less competitive than the daytime hours. So there might be a relax on the fee then, but it doesn't necessarily come down to union versus non-union traffic.
Okay, thank you. We had another question come through while you were presenting. I believe it was based on the rankings of those ports. Came from Benjamin. Are those numbers based on TEU throughput? Is that right, Benjamin? Do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I was just curious about those rankings, Mr. Drake. I knew that LA and Long Beach were, the busiest ports on the U.S., but I didn't realize they were so low on the global ranking. So I was just wondering what those were based on.
Yeah, so the rankings are based on a report that IHC and the World Bank put together. The productivity rankings are based largely around how quickly a 1 TEU container will be moved off ship and moved on its way. So the time involved in that movement specifically.
Okay, that's helpful. And then I did have one other question.
Yeah.
Kind of as you touched on in the presentation, a lot of this congestion has been due to the consumer demand in the U.S. through the pandemic. There's been some talk as things loosen up, maybe we see spending shifting more towards services. Obviously, with the Omicron variant, we could be going back to where we were, where people don't want to pay for services, they want to pay for goods. But I think I read an article this morning talking about how that could be the case, but the firepower of the American consumer is much less than before because there's no more stimulus payments. Have you seen any data, or can you speak to that at all about how spending power might be affected by the change in stimulus payments and how that could affect the supply chain?
Yeah, so far we're not seeing any let up in the appetite of the U.S. consumer to spend, and there still remains to be significant spending by the U.S. consumer over and above, I think, historical levels. I think already, for this Christmas holiday season, we're seeing retail sales up what they were in years past. So I think for the time being, we're not necessarily seeing a huge decrease, but we are seeing that the ports have taken a number of steps to try to move stuff a little more quickly than they have been. So we are seeing, so while consumption is still pretty high, and I think your observation is correct that over the long term, consumption will decrease as the stimulus dollars leave the system. We think that it's going to continue to be, there's going to continue to be significant pressure on the ports with more and more ships coming in.
Thank you for your answers in the presentation.
Yeah.
We've got another question here in the chat from John Cargill, asking about the chamber's activities. Is the chamber trying to fight the dwell time fee in the Southern California ports?
We have not taken a position on the dwell time fee per se. We have been pushing for the terminal operators to be more open with the rules that govern how the chassis and containers are being exchanged. We were an advocate for the 24/7 operation as well. But we do believe that those fees are important because they do allow terminal operators to recover the costs involved with running their operations. So they shouldn't necessarily be touched on. Excuse me, they shouldn't be diminished so that these terminals are losing money.
Okay. We have time for probably one or two more questions if anybody has one.
I have a question. Is it, I had read somewhere that part of the trucking problem arose from the stringent environmental laws in California, that ages of trucks was some of the reasons some trucks couldn't go in, because they were too old and too, I guess, pollution prone. Is there any truth to that you know of?
You know, so I have heard that, and that relates back to the Clean Trucks program that the ports of LA and Long Beach implemented a few years ago, where, you know, out of response to the public's opposition to port traffic that was going through and the pollution that was associated with those trucks, both ports implemented requirements that newer trucks could only access the ports themselves in order to reduce the amount of emissions coming from those tailpipes. You know, I think, to answer your question directly, I think it has an effect, but I don't think it's having I think the larger impact, of course, is just that there's just so much container traffic coming through and so many containers that are piling up that it's overwhelming the system as a whole. And I think I will also tell you that I think, you know, on the terminal side as well, there's been a lot of frustrated turns. And by that, what I mean is a trucker will come onto a terminal with an empty container or the chassis that they're looking to exchange for a full container. And they'll be rejected by the terminal operator because either the chassis or the container isn't one that is controlled by that terminal. And so they'll have that frustrated turn, which means they're turned away and they have to go back and either go to a different terminal or find out where they're going to go to next. And when you take into account how much time it takes to go from you know, the original warehouse to the terminal and back, that could be like 1 or 2 hours. And as a driver, you've got 11 hours in that day, and you've already used up more than 1/5 of your working time because of that.
Great. Well, that's about.
We've got one more from Jim Newport.
Oh, we've got one more here from Jim Newport. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Dalton and John. I represent the Oklahoma Trucking Association. I appreciate your comments on not just trucking and the driver shortage, but all of these issues. I would remind the listeners that the previous question you just asked often go towards California regulatory environment in general. For example, the containers that John speaks of, there has been a long standing that those could only be stacked oftentimes 3 high. Well, a possible relief would be something temporary that would allow those containers to be stacked 5 high, for example. And I'm talking about the terminal areas and the surrounding areas. The participants here may not realize when you say chassis, that's a specialized trailer that ocean carrier, container literally sits down and snaps onto. So when we were kids and we had recycled Coca-Cola bottles, for example, you have to bring that empty chassis back to put a container on it. You can't just show up with a flatbed. Well, nobody wants to bring the chassis back because it doesn't pay the same amount as a full load that leaves the port. In terms of driver shortages, yes, that is true. We've had 30 and 40,000 shortages, but we've had that for well over a decade, closer to 15 years. That has been a known fact. However, our shelves didn't go empty then or now until we all made a run on toilet paper last March. And even then, the trucking never stopped. So I appreciate Mr. Drake's comments about the ports and some of the inefficiencies for US compared to the rest of the world. However, having said all of that, there's a delicate dance of every link in the chain, the supply chain, and they all have to be working at optimization. And right now we're not seeing that, not from the manufacturing side, workforce, shipping. Even if you ran the ports 24 hours a day, Used to, a truck would go in and it would take 2 hours to come out of a port. Now you're looking at 6 and 8 hours. It's not because the truck isn't there. It's because of the inability or a lack of optimization, not at the ports, but everywhere. If you did get loaded and you leave the port, you need a distribution or a warehouse that's open 24/7, and often they're not. So again, I just wanted to expand that as Mr. Drake has eloquently pointed out, it goes far and wide from manufacturing, production, shipping, even to the dock workers on the receiving end. So anyway, appreciate this. This has been good information.
Yeah, and sir, just to follow up, I mean, I think the trucking industry has done a wonderful job of articulating the challenges that are before them, right? I think on the, you're correct. There was a truck driver shortage in place well before COVID, and it's been exacerbated by what's happened in the last couple of years. But my understanding is not so much that, while the trucking industry is challenged, you're absolutely right that they're not the crux of the challenge we're facing right now. And in fact, by all accounts, they seem to be doing very, very well when you take into account sort of the driver shortages they're having and the other challenges that are in front of them. But what I have been hearing from the ports of LA and Long Beach is that the truck driver shortage isn't the biggest impediment. It's not, the trucking industry is doing a very good job of serving both ports, and the driver shortage itself is not impacting their ability to serve the ports. I think to your larger point, there are a lot of players in the supply chain. Each one plays a very important role, but they don't control the supply chain as a whole. And there's a lot of cracks in the system that I think cumulatively are adding up to the challenge we're seeing today. Is that fair for you?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I agree, and I appreciate your comments. We're on the same page.
All right. Well, thank you all. That's all the time that we have for today. John, especially want to thank you for your comments today. They've been extremely helpful to help us boil down this extremely complex issue. So thank you for your time today. We want to continue to hear from our membership on this issue. So if you have any specific thoughts or concerns or things that you're facing, be sure to let your membership representative know and continue that engagement with us. We'd love to hear from you. These slides that John presented today, we will get those out to everybody. Sorry for the technical issues that we had there, but we'll be sure to get those slides out so that you can look at them on your own time. So with that, thank you all for being here. John, thank you again. And especially want to thank Delisi for sponsoring this event for us today. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you guys in the future.
Thank you again.